anlam katmanlarını yavaş yavaş aralamaya başlayalım. İlk katman neymiş bakalım?
Şimdi yazarın analizine göre Kur'an
Merhaba, bu kaynaklara birlikte yakından bakmaya hazır mısın? Önümüzde Profesör Doktor Muhammet Nur Doğan'ın Kur'an'ın Din dediği kitabından çok dikkat çekici bölümler var.
evet,
Yazarın temel tezi şu: Kur'an'daki din kavramı aslında sandığımızdan çok daha geniş, farklı anlamlara sahip. Ama zamanla bu anlamlar ya daraltılmış ya da göz ardı edilmiş. İşte bu iddiayı merkeze alacağız.
aynen öyle. Bu incelemede bizim amacımız da yazarın Kur'an metinleri üzerinden yaptığı analizleri takip etmek aslında. Yani din kelimesinin Kur'an'daki o çok katmanlı yapısını biraz olsun anlamaya çalışmak. Kitap diyor ki, bu kelime genelde ilk akla gelen o belirli inanç ve ritüeller bütünü tanımının çok ötesine geçiyor. Adeta hayatın tamamını kuşatan bir çerçeve sunuyor.
Anlıyorum. Yani yazar aslında şunu mu söylüyor? Bugün bizim yaygın olarak kullandığımız din algısı var ya,
Evet,
Sal dünyasına bir girelim bakalım, bu kelimenin izini sürelim. Bu keşif sırasında dinin sadece bir inanç meselesi olmadığını göreceğiz gibi.
kesinlikle.
Aynı zamanda bir yaşam tarzı, bir hukuk sistemi, bir hesaplaşma, derin bir bağlılık pek çok anlam barındırıyor sanki.
Evet. Kitabın ön sözünde yazarın altını çizdiği çok kritik bir iddia var zaten. Diyor ki, din kavramı tarih içinde o orijinal Kur'ani bağlamından koparılmış. Anlam daralmasına uğramış, hatta belki içi boşaltılmış. Günümüzdeki din anlayışı, Kur'an'ın vurguladığı temel ilkelerden ziyade daha çok böyle kültürel alışkanlıklara dayanabiliyor.
Mesela?
İşte yazar örnekler veriyor. Şekilciliğe indirgenmiş pratikler, tesbih çekmek, türbe ziyaretleri gibi bazı uygulamaları sayıyor. Bunların Kur'an'daki din kavramının özünü temsil etmediğini savunuyor aslında.
Yani yazar bu durumun, bu kavram daralmasının veya içinin boşaltılmasının sadece bireysel değil, toplumsal düzeyde de ciddi sonuçları olabileceğini mi ima ediyor anladığım kadarıyla?
Evet, aynen öyle. Bu da tabii Kur'an'ın kendi perspektifine dönme ihtiyacını daha da önemli kılıyor.
Peki, o halde bu anlam katmanlarını yavaş yavaş aralamaya başlayalım. İlk katman neymiş bakalım?
Şimdi yazarın analizine göre Kur'an'da din kelimesinin en temel, en kapsayıcı anlamlarından biri Allah'a tam bir teslimiyet.
Teslimiyet.
Evet. Ali İmran suresi 19. ayette geçen Allah katında din şüphesiz İslam'dır, yani teslimiyettir ifadesi burada kilit. İşin ilginç yanı bu teslimiyet sadece insana özgüde görülmüyor. Yazar, Ali İmran ve Nahl surelerindeki çeşitli ayetlere işaret ediyor. Mesela Ali İmran 83, Nahl 48-52 gibi.
Evet.
Diyor ki, tüm evren, yani göklerde ve yeryüzünde ne varsa, hepsi isteyerek veya istemeyerek Allah'ın koyduğu yasalara tabi. Yani ona bir şekilde teslim olmuş durumda. Bu, evrenin doğal işleyiş düzeni olarak sunuluyor.
Vay canına, bu bayağı geniş bir bakış açısıymış. Yani doğadaki o kusursuz denge, fizik kanunları, canlıların içgüdüsel davranışları, bütün bunlar da mı din kapsamında? Yani Allah'ın düzenine bir tür teslimiyet olarak mı okunabilir yazarın yorumuna göre?
Aynen öyle yorumluyor, evet. Yazar bu kozmik teslimiyetin altını özellikle çiziyor. İnsanın bilinçli teslimiyetinin ideal örneği olarak da Kur'an'da sık sık İbrahim peygamberin inanç sistemi.
Evet, İbrahim peygamber.
Yani onun milleti ki bu kelime burada tek tanrı inancına, yani tevhide ve Allah'a teslimiyete dayalı yol anlamına geliyor işte. Bu vurgulanıyor. Bakara ve Nisa surelerinde ilgili ayetler var. Mesela Bakara 130, 133, Nisa 125, 126 gibi. Bu modele işaret ediyor. Hatta Bakara 130'da geçen o soru var ya, kendini bilmeyenden başka kim İbrahim'in dininden, milletinden yüz çevirir sorusu. Yazarın yorumuna göre bu aklını kullananlar için tevhid ve teslimiyet yolunun ne kadar temel, ne kadar rasyonel olduğunu gösteriyor.
Bu evrensel ve İbrahimi teslimiyet fikri gerçekten ilginç. Peki insan bu bilinçli teslimiyete nasıl ulaşıyor? Bu yol nasıl çiziliyor? Kaynak din kavramının başka bir anlam katmanına yani ilahi rehberliğe işaret ediyor mu?
Kesinlikle ediyor. Yazar din kelimesinin Ali İmran 73'te Allah'ın rehberliği yani Hüdallah ile eş anlamlı kullanıldığına dikkat çekiyor.
Hüdallah.
Evet, dolayısıyla din aynı zamanda Allah'ın insanlığa sunduğu yol göstericilik anlamına geliyor. Bu rehberliğin temel aracı ne? Vahiy, yani kitap.
Anladım.
Hatta yazar Fatiha suresindeki kendilerine nimet verdiklerinin yolu ifadesindeki nimet kelimesinin bağlam içinde doğrudan vahiy veya kitap anlamına gelebileceğini bile öne sürüyor. Yani doğru yol, vahyin aydınlattığı yol. Bu vahiy Allah'ın bir lütfu, fazla olarak dinin bilgi kaynağını oluşturuyor. Bu nedenle de mesajın anlamını saptırmamak çok önemli. Nisa 46'daki uyarı gibi mesela. Ve özellikle anlaşmazlıklarda veya hüküm verirken başvurulacak temel kaynağın Allah'ın kitabı olması.
Yani ataların yolu değil.
Aynen, ataların yolu değil, Allah'ın indirdiği vahyin esas alınması gerektiğini Kur'an sürekli vurguluyor diyor yazar. Ali İmran 23-24 ışığında bu çok net.
O zaman din sadece kalpte hissedilen bir teslimiyet ya da böyle teorik bir rehberlik değil, aynı zamanda hayata yön veren somut bir yol, bir sistem, hatta bir yasa anlamına da geliyor anlaşılan. Fatiha'daki sırat-ı müstekim yani dosdoğru yol talebi bunu mu ifade ediyor?
Tam olarak öyle. Yazar Fatiha'daki bu ifadenin yanı sıra En'am suresindeki ayetlere atıfta bulunuyor 153 ve 161'e.
Evet.
Ve bu dosdoğru yolun bizzat din olarak tanımlandığını gösteriyor. Dinen kıyemen yani sapasağlam din. Ve bu dinin yine İbrahim'in yolu olduğu belirtiliyor.
Peki bu sistem neleri içeriyor?
Bu sistem hayatın pratiğini düzenleyen ilkeleri de içeriyor tabii. Nelerin yapılması uygun yani helal, nelerin kaçınılması gerekiyor yani haram. Bu gibi sınırları çiziyor. Maide ve En'am surelerindeki bazı ayetler, örneğin Maide 3-4 veya En'am 151-153 bu çerçevenin örneklerini sunuyor. Burada yazarın ilginç bir karşılaştırması var. Diyor ki, Kur'an dini aslında az sayıda temel yasakla insanlara geniş bir özgürlük ve hareket alanı bırakıyor. Ama buna karşılık insanlar tarafından zamanla oluşturulan dini yorumlar veya gelenekler hayatı gereksiz pek çok kural ve yasakla boğabiliyor.
Bu hayatı boğmama fikri şeyle de bağlantılı o zaman. Dinde zorlama yoktur ilkesiyle. Bakara 256'da geçiyor. Bir de Haç suresi 78'de o din konusunda üzerinize hiçbir zorluk yüklemedi diyor. Yazar bu zorluk olmamasını nasıl açıklıyor peki?
Yazar bu zorluk olmaması halini 3 temel boyutta ele alıyor. Birincisi, Kur'an dininin akıl karıştırıcı, karmaşık dogmalardan uzak, yani anlaşılır bir yapıda olması.
Anlaşılır olması.
İkincisi, hayatı çekilmez hale getiren anlamsız ritüellerden, tabulardan veya aşırı şekilcilikten arınmış olması. Üçüncüsü ise, dünyadan el etek çekmeyi savunan, bedene eziyeti öngören çileci, yani asketik yaklaşımlara kapalı olması. Yani fıtrata uygun, yaşanabilir, dengeli bir yol sunması.
Din, yasa ve sistem anlamına geldiğini söyledin. Peki bu yargı veya hesap verme boyutuyla nasıl ilişkileniyor? Bu da var mı içinde?
Olmaz mı? Bu da din kelimesinin çok önemli bir anlam katmanı. Yasa, yargı ve karşılık. Yazar, mesela Yusuf suresi 76. ayette geçen dinül melik ifadesini örnek veriyor. Burada din, doğrudan Mısır kralının yürürlükteki yasası anlamında kullanılmış.
İlginç.
Nur suresi 2. ayette zina suçuna verilecek cezadan bahsedilirken yine din kavramı Allah'ın yasası bağlamında devreye giriyor. Daha da ötesi var. Nur 25'te kıyamet gününde insanların dünyadaki eylemlerinin tam karşılığının verilmesi dinehumül hak, yani hak ettikleri din karşılık olarak ifade ediliyor.
İşte din günü buradan geliyor o zaman.
Aynen öyle. Fatiha'da ve Şuara 82'de geçen meşhur Yevmüddin, yani din günü de tam olarak bu hesap, yargı ve karşılık görme gününe işaret ediyor. Yazarın burada yine dikkat çekici bir yorumu var yalnız.
Nedir o?
Fatiha'daki Yevmüddin'in sadece ahiret gününü değil, aynı zamanda bu dünya hayatındaki adalet, sebep-sonuç ilişkisi ve eylemlerin karşılığını görme sürecinde kapsayabileceğini öne sürüyor. Yani sadece ahirete ait bir kavram değil belki de.
Anladım. Peki, Kur'an'da sıkça geçen ve güçlü bir vurgu taşıyan bir ifade var. Dini yalnızca Allah'a has kılmak. Muhlisine lehüddin diye geçiyor sanırım. Kaynak bunu nasıl açıyor? Bu ifadenin tam olarak karşılığı ne?
Evet, muhlisine lehuddin. Bu ifade yazarın analizine göre Kur'an'ın tevhid yani Allah'ın birliği ilkesinin belki de en saf, en yoğun ifadesi. En temel anlamıyla şu: her türlü ibadeti, duayı, sığınmayı, itaati, kısacası kalbin ve eylemlerin yönelişini aracısız ve katıksız bir şekilde sadece ve sadece Allah'a yöneltmek.
Şirk koşmamak yani.
Aynen, ona hiçbir şeyi veya kimseyi ortak koşmamak, şirkten tamamen arınmak demek. Araf 29 ve Beyyine 5 gibi ayetler bunu doğrudan emrediyor zaten. Hatta Kur'an bu hali tasvir etmek için çok canlı bir metafor kullanır.
Nasıl bir metafor?
Fırtınalı denizde batma tehlikesiyle karşı karşıya kalan bir gemideki insanlar, hani dalgalar dört bir yandan sarınca, daha önce güvendikleri, yardım umdukları her şeyi unutup tam bir çaresizlik ve içtenlikle sadece Allah'a yalvarırlar ya.
Evet, biliyorum o ayetleri.
İşte Yunus, Ankebut ve Lokman surelerinde bu dramatik tablo çizilir. İşte dini Allah'a has kılmak, tam olarak o andaki gibi bir arınmışlık, bir samimiyet ve mutlak yöneliş halini ifade ediyor.
Anlıyorum. Ancak o ayetlerin devamında da tehlike geçip gemi karaya ulaşınca o insanlardan bazılarının tekrar eski şirk koşma veya Allah'ı unutma hallerine döndükleri de anlatılıyor. Bu durum o saf bağlılık halini sürekli kılmanın ne kadar zor olduğunu mu gösteriyor?
Kesinlikle. Bu, insan doğasındaki bir gerilime işaret ediyor aslında. O zor zamanda yakalanan saf tevhid halini, hayatın normal akışında, rahatlık ve güvenlik zamanlarında da sürdürebilmek. İşte asıl mesele bu. Yazar, bu dini Allah'a has kılma ifadesinin sadece kalpteki yönelişle sınırlı kalmadığını da ekliyor.
Nasıl yani? Başka ne anlamı var?
Aynı zamanda bilgi ve otorite kaynağı açısından da bir anlam taşıdığını vurguluyor. Özellikle Araf suresi 28-30 bağlamında ele alındığında bu ifade şu anlama da geliyor: din konusunda hüküm koyma, rehberlik etme ve uyulacak kuralları belirleme yetkisi sadece Allah'a aittir. Bunu kabul etmek. Bu konuda sadece Allah'ın vahyine, yani kitabına dayanmak ve insanlar tarafından uydurulmuş inançları, uygulamaları, otoriteleri veya atalardan kalma gelenekleri reddetmek. Yani hem kalpte tevhid hem de kaynakta tevhid.
Çok net. Peki, Kur'an dinin ne olduğunu anlatırken onun nasıl bozulabileceği, nasıl tahrif edilebileceği konusunda da uyarıyor mu? Yazar bu çarpıtmalara nasıl değiniyor?
Evet, Kur'an bu konuda çok net uyarılarda bulunuyor. Yazar bunlardan bazılarını şöyle sıralıyor. Birincisi, dini bir oyun ve eğlence konusu yapmak.
Oyun ve eğlence.
Veya tam tersi, geçici dünya hayatını ve zevkleri hayatın tek amacı haline getirip onu din edinmek. En'am 70 ve Araf 51'de buna işaret ediliyor. Bu, dinin ciddiyetini ve asıl amacını yitirmesi demek.
İkincisi?
İkincisi ve en temeli tabii ki Allah'a ortak koşmak, yani şirk. Tevbe 31'de örneklendiği gibi din adamlarını, hahamları, rahipleri Allah'ın yanı sıra sözlerine kayıtsız şartsız uyulacak otoriteler, yani Rabler edinmek de bu kapsamda değerlendiriliyor.
Anladım.
Üçüncüsü, dinin sınırlarını aşmak, aşırılığa kaçmak. Nisa 171 ve Maide 77'de mesela Hristiyanların İsa peygambere ilahlık vasfı yüklemeleri gibi inançlardaki aşırılıklar eleştiriliyor. Dördüncüsü, dinde bölünmelere yol açmak. Temel ilkelerde birleşmek yerine teferruatta ayrılıp anlamsız fırkalara, gruplara ayrılmak. En'am 159, Rum 32 gibi ayetler buna değiniyor. Çünkü tevhid dini birleştirici olmayı hedefler aslında.
Evet.
Beşincisi ise dine ve onun değerlerine karşı düşmanca bir tavır sergilemek. Onu karalamaya çalışmak, Tevbe 12 veya alay konusu yapmak, Maide 57.
Anladım. Yani Kur'an sadece işte din budur demekle kalmıyor, bakın bu din değildir diyerek sınırları da netleştiriyor. Bu da kavramın doğru anlaşılması için önemli bir çerçeve sunuyor aslında.
Çok doğru bir tespit. Son olarak şunu da eklemek lazım. Din sadece inanç ve bilgi değil, aynı zamanda eylemle bütünleşen bir bağlılık. Kur'an bu eylem boyutunu sürekli vurgular. Yazarın dikkat çektiği bazı temel eylemler var.
Neler mesela?
Birincisi, salatı ikame etmek ve zekatı vermek. Bu ikili sıkça birlikte geçer. Hac 78, Beynine 5, Tevbe 11.
Evet, çok sık geçer.
Burada kaynakta yani kitapta potansiyel olarak biraz tartışmalı sayılabilecek bir yorum var. Yazar diyor ki, Kur'an'ın salatı ikame etme emri ilk başta bugün bildiğimiz ritüelden çok yeni kurulan Müslüman toplumunu aktif olarak maddi ve sosyal yönden destekleme, yani o sosyal yapıyı ve bağı ayakta tutma anlamına gelmiş olabilir mi?
İlginç bir yorum.
Tevbe suresinin 11. ayetine dayanarak yeni Müslümanlardan öncelikle beklenen şeyin bu aktif katılım olabileceğini öne sürüyor. Zekatı ise sadece belli bir malın belli bir oranını vermek değil, daha genel olarak arınmak ve arındırmak amacıyla karşılıksız harcamada bulunmak olarak yorumluyor. Daha geniş bir anlam yüklüyor.
Peki başka hangi eylemler var?
İkincisi, Allah yolunda çaba göstermek. Hac 78'de bu da salat ve zekatla birlikte anılıyor. Yazar bunun sadece savaşmak olmadığını, Allah'ın rızası için gösterilen her türlü meşru gayreti kapsadığını belirtiyor. Üçüncüsü, iyi ve yararlı işler yapmak, yani salih amel işlemek. Hac 77. Din sonuçta ahlaklı ve topluma faydalı eylemlerle hayata geçiyor.
Dördüncüsü?
Dördüncüsü, din konusunda derinlemesine bilgi sahibi olmak. Tefakkufi din diye geçiyor Tevbe 122'de ve bu bilgiyi topluma aktarmak. Yazar, buradaki din bilgisinin sadece fıkıh veya ilmihal bilgisiyle sınırlı olmayabileceğini söylüyor. Yani insanın ve toplumun yararına olan her türlü derinlikli bilgiyi ve uzmanlaşmayı kapsayabilir. Önemli olan bu bilgiyi toplum yararına kullanmaktır diyor.
Anladım.
Son olarak da din, takva ile yani Allah'a karşı derin bir sorumluluk bilinciyle de iç içe. Nahl 52'deki din, itaat, düzen daima O'nundur ifadesiyle, Ali İmran 83'teki evrensel teslimiyet birlikte düşünüldüğünde bu bilinçli sorumluluğun önemi daha da belirginleşiyor.
Gerçekten de başta düşündüğümüzden çok daha zengin, çok boyutlu bir kavram haritası çıktı karşımıza. Yani evrensel bir teslimiyet yasasından başlıyor.
Evet.
Kişisel rehberliğe, toplumsal düzene, yasalara, hesap gününe, kalpteki o en saf bağlılığa ve nihayetinde somut eylemlere, bilgiye ve sorumluluğa kadar uzanan geniş bir yelpaze. Din kelimesi Kur'an'da adeta yaşayan, nefes alan bir organizma gibi.
Aynen öyle. Profesör Doktor Muhammet Nur Doğan'ın kitabındaki temel argüman da zaten bu zenginliği ve dinamizmi ortaya koymak. Yazarın vurgusu şu, Kur'an'daki din kavramının bu çok katmanlı yapısını fark etmek. Bu, onu sadece kültürel alışkanlıklara, şekilsel ritüellere veya daraltılmış anlamlara indirgeyen anlayışlardan ne kadar farklı. Kitabın sunduğu perspektife göre din, statik bir inançlar listesi değil, hayatın her vecihesine dokunan, bireyi ve toplumu dönüştürmeyi amaçlayan dinamik, kapsamlı bir sistem.
Bu kapsamlı incelemenin sonuna gelirken aklımızda bir soru beliriyor ve bunu sana, dinleyenimize yöneltmek istiyoruz. Din kelimesinin Kur'an'daki bu farklı anlam katmanlarını, hani teslimiyet, yol, yasa, hesap, samimiyet, eylem dedik ya, bütüncül olarak düşünmek, acaba senin din kavramına, kendi değerlerine veya hayatı anlamlandırma biçimine bakışını nasıl etkileyebilir? Belki de üzerinde biraz daha kafa yormaya değer bir nokta.
Kesinlikle.
Bir sonraki derinlemesine yolculukta tekrar buluşmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.
Hoşça kalın.
Welcome to the deep dive, where we really try to get under the surface of fascinating material. Today, we're tackling something huge, a concept that shapes billions of lives, but maybe it's not always understood the way it was originally intended. We're talking about din. Welcome to the deep dive, where we really try to get under the surface of fascinating material. Today, we're tackling something huge, a concept that shapes billions of lives, but maybe it's not always understood the way it was originally intended. We're talking about din. A lot of us probably think, yeah, I know what din means, but what if the Quranic core of it has been kind of skewered over centuries, you know? Our main source today is Professor Muhammet Nur Doğan's work, قُر'انın dindedicini, and it promises to, well, strip away some of those misunderstandings, get back to the original meaning.
That's exactly right. Professor Doğan, he makes this really compelling case that over time, history has led to what he calls a vulgarization of key Quranic terms. They get reduced, he argues, to sort of shells, empty shells, losing their original depth. And that obviously impacts how people understand their whole path. So this deep dive, it's really about trying to grasp what the Quran actually meant by din and challenging that assumption that our current ideas always match up with the divine intent.
Okay, so our mission then is to uncover that pure Quranic understanding of din, explore its different but connected meanings, and maybe see how it stacks up against what the source calls these fabricated dins, the ones that apparently make life harder, more restrictive, instead of freeing. Let's dive in.
Okay, so Professor Doğan starts right at the heart of the problem. He says the idea of din in many people's minds today, it often clashes pretty significantly with Allah's original message in the Quran. He points to things like, cultural baggage, superstitions, human interpretations piling up over time, and they've kind of stripped din of its real identity, its expansive meaning. He even uses the word heartbreaking to describe the gap between the current perception in some places and the original intent.
Wow. So if I'm getting this right, the source is saying din has almost become something else entirely. Like you have this beautiful original vase, but now it's holding something completely different, maybe something less valuable.
Precisely. That's a great analogy. The book really tries to diagnose how these meanings shifted. It shows how the Quran's din, which it describes consistently as easy, liberating, progressive, how that's been replaced by these human-made, fabricated dins, and those are often painted as difficult, scary, even enslaving. And according to Doğan, these fabricated versions, they pull us away from the Quran itself, from using our intellect, and from fitra.
Fitra, right, that innate sense of things.
Exactly, that deep-down human nature that just recognizes truth and simplicity when it sees it.
That's a really powerful starting point. And Professor Doğan goes even deeper, doesn't he? Right into the etymology, the roots of the word din. Seems like the word itself holds a ton of meaning.
Oh, absolutely. Etymologically, din is like, well, it's like a gemstone with many facets. Each one reflects a different part of this whole picture. It covers meanings like measure, reckoning, system, obedience, submission, sanction, debt, even punishment and reward, judgment, rule.
That's quite a list.
It is. And what's fascinating is how they're not really separate ideas. They're all woven together. Din isn't just belief. It's about living by a divine measure, submitting to a system that brings order, and knowing it all leads ultimately to judgment. It's a whole framework for how we exist, guiding actions, intentions.
Okay, now here's something that really jumped out at me from the source. Professor Doğan talks about Yevmudin, the day of din. Usually that means the day of judgment, right? In the hereafter. But he points out that in Surah Al-Fatiha, the very opening of the Quran, verses 2 to 7 specifically, it takes on this extra layer of meaning, something about this world.
Yes, and that's such a crucial distinction for understanding how relevant din is, like right now in our daily lives. In Al-Fatiha, Yevmudin points more specifically to the world day or world time. It means living our present lives according to these defined measures, spiritual, ethical, even legal ones. Knowing that our actions have consequences here and now. So when you think of Yevmudin as this world day, it means every choice you make, every interaction, it all carries weight. It's like a daily accounting measured against that divine standard. So din isn't just about waiting for the hereafter. It's about our conscious measured life today, how we conduct ourselves.
And the source also mentions surat, the path, as basically a synonym for din, carrying all those implications for faith and how we behave.
Exactly. It's the roadmap. A comprehensive one for navigating both the spiritual journey and our worldly duties.
So through all this complexity, Professor Doğan keeps coming back to one core idea, right? To kind of simplify it all. That din, in its purest form, is just total submission to Allah.
Indeed. That's the bedrock. Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 130-133, defines din as Prophet Abraham's belief system, pure, sincere submission to Allah alone. And this principle, Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, it's the backbone. for our ethics, our actions. It gives us this clear, unwavering framework for how we deal with the world, with others, with ourselves.
So it's not just some historical thing then, stuck back in Abraham's time. It's universal.
Not at all, no. The source traces it through all the prophets.
Yeah.
Abraham, Jacob, Ishmael, Isaac, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, peace be upon them all. They were all entrusted with the same fundamental system: belief, action, ethics, which is essentially Islam in its broadest meaning. That state of peaceful submission.
Okay.
It's the original blueprint, you could say. And it brings this sense of inner freedom, actually, moral clarity, because your ultimate loyalty isn't divided. For you listening, this means things like consistency in your character, a clear ethical compass, knowing you belong to this long universal spiritual line. It simplifies everything because there's one single focus point.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so if this pure submission, this tawhid, is the core of din, then the next obvious question is, well, who gets to define how we submit? Where's the authority?
Exactly. And the Quran is very clear on this. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 193, it states unequivocally, the authority to define din belongs only to Allah. Exclusively, it's about clearing away the artificial stuff. Human-made rules, attempts to grab spiritual authority where it doesn't belong. This ensures worship, service. It's all directed just to Allah. No fear, no coercion.
Yeah.
It pushes back against any human trying to take over that divine role of setting the standards for a righteous life. The Creator sets the standards, not human whims or traditions.
And that leads right into another really powerful point. If din is about submitting to Allah's authority, how is that submission supposed to happen? Professor Dashan highlights that key principle. There is no compulsion in din dinde zerlama yoktur from Al-Baqarah 256, right?
Yes, that verse is absolutely foundational. According to the source, it means din covering faith, morals, how we live. It has to come from conviction. The core is obedience and service to Allah, with tawhid as the unshakable system. But true submission, it comes from the heart, from the mind. You can't force it on someone. It's about consciously choosing to reject takhat, those false authorities, idols, anything that pulls you away from Allah, and choosing submission to Him alone. This links right into Hudallah, God's guidance.
Yeah.
Din is the system built on that guidance, perfected by it, like it says in Al-Imran 72-74. And the beauty is the guidance lights the path, but you still have the choice to walk it. That's what makes it truly freeing, not forced.
This contrast you mentioned between Allah's freeing din and the human-made versions, that seems really important. How does Professor Dozan spell out that difference?
He draws a very sharp line. Allah's din is described consistently as easy, liberating. Mostly permissible, actually, with just a few specific things forbidden. Think about Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 3-4. The source calls the Quran a freedom manifesto there, saying, all good things of life are made lawful for you.
A freedom manifesto, I like that.
Yeah. And the things that are forbidden, they're primarily to protect us, our health, our dignity. Things like avoiding carrion, intoxicants, idolatry. The source really stresses that in Allah's din, the default setting is permissibility, freedom. The few prohibitions are like necessary guardrails, not prison bars.
So the Quranic din is mostly saying yes to the good things in life with just a few essential no's for our own protection.
Precisely. And those yeses, they cover this huge space for living, innovating, appreciating beauty, building things, connecting, learning. The no's are very few, protecting basics like human well-being and dignity. But then you get the fabricated dins, the ones based on human desires, traditions, superstitions. They tend to flip that script completely.
How so?
They become rigid, fear-based,
Yeah.
filled with prohibitions, making life seem difficult, joyless. Imagine you're building something amazing. Allah's din gives you wide freedom to design and build with just a few core structural rules for safety. Fabricated dins, though, they might try to dictate the color of every brick, the exact angle of every joint, stifling creativity, making it all exhausting.
That's a great image.
And Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 51-58, even warns that taking leaders from outside Allah's path is straying from din, because those alliances can compromise the core principles, divide the community.
And that verse in Surah Al-An'am 70-72 about people taking play and entertainment as their din, that really hits home, like making a religion out of distractions, prioritizing fleeting things over a real connection.
It really does. And it connects directly to what Surah Al-Imran, verse 23, says about false beliefs leading to a betrayal of din. When people turn away from Allah's book, following their own whims or invented ideas instead, they're essentially creating their own little religion, where satisfying immediate desires replaces that deeper spiritual alignment. They've strayed from the pure din.
Okay, so din is clearly central, but the source also shows it's not isolated, right? It's deeply connected with other key Quranic ideas like salat and taqwa.
Yes, exactly. The source really highlights the incredible consistency within the Quran's language. Din often pops up synonymously or very closely linked with salat and taqwa. They're not separate boxes. They're part of this coherent, interwoven system that shows just how holistic din really is.
Now, salat. Most people think of ritual prayer. Does Professor Doğan push beyond that standard translation?
Yes, significantly. In places like Surah Al-Ma'idah 57:58 and Al-Hajj 77:78, salat is actually equated with upholding the din or upholding tawheed.
Upholding the din, so not just the prayer itself.
Right. When the Quran says uphold salat, it's not solely about the mat and the timings, though those are part of it. It's about actively participating in the struggle to establish Allah's din in society. That means upholding justice, standing for truth, actively working towards a society where Allah's principles of fairness, compassion, mercy, where those things actually thrive.
Wow.
It's about being an agent for positive change. So it totally transforms salat from just a personal act into this wider societal mission.
That is a profound shift. It's aligning our actions with this whole framework, impacting everything. And you mentioned the source even looks at that tricky verse in Surah Al-Anfal, verse 35, about the salat of the polytheists. It clarifies that wasn't ritual prayer. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. This is really key to avoid misunderstandings. The source argues that in Al-Anfal 35, their salat wasn't prayer. It was their acts of protest against the Prophet establishing din. Things like whistling and clapping disruptively around the Kaaba. So understanding this shows salat in its dynamic sense, active engagement regarding Allah's system, not just a static ritual.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about taqwa? How does that fit into this bigger picture of din?
Well, Surah An-Nahl, verses 48-52, the source points out a strong din taqwa identity. Taqwa is described as that deep consciousness of your responsibility to Allah. Reverence, constant awareness of Him. Look at the universe, the stars, the creatures, they all submit to Allah's laws naturally, right?
Right.
Humans are called to consciously emulate that submission. So din and taqwa become almost interchangeable. Both point to living with this conscious, reverent alignment with divine principles. It shapes your inner world, your outer actions, living with integrity, purpose.
It's clear this authentic din is meant to be liberating, holistic. But what are the consequences then when people stray from this path? The source sounds pretty strong about the dangers, especially when people ignore the Qur'an's pure message.
It does, yes. It describes the consequences of creating what it terms parallel books and parallel religions as, frankly, catastrophic. Surah Al-An'am, verse 159, directly warns against those who fracture the unity of their din, breaking off into sects and groups. This is called a bad deed, a siyi. It's seen as deeply destructive, undermining unity of belief, undermining our collective purpose.
And the source sees this pattern repeating, tracing it back to earlier communities like the Jews and Christians.
Exactly. It's not presented as a new problem. Surah At-Tawbah, verses 30-35, critiques earlier communities, like the Jews elevating the Talmud, or Christians whose later Gospels overshadowed the original Injil. They introduced human texts and interpretations that, according to the source, fundamentally warped the divine message. And it warns against the same happening within the Muslim Ummah, the global community. Things like collections of hadith potentially overshadowing the Quran's authority, or mystical writings. The source mentions things like Miznevi, Razainur, Fusul Hikam, that might claim a kind of divine inspiration or try to supplement the Quran. When people turn from Allah's clear, single message in the Quran to follow human interpretations, whether old traditions or new insights, the source argues it inevitably leads to division, confusion.
The source uses that striking phrase, attempts to extinguish Allah's light with their mouths. That's powerful imagery.
It really is. It's a metaphor for trying to dilute or obscure that clear, liberating message of Tawhid with human-made complexities, dogmas, superstitions. But the Quran insists Allah won't let His light be put out. His din will ultimately shine through and prevail over all these distorted understandings, no matter how many parallel religions try to cloud the issue. The truth has a way of enduring.
This whole deep dive has really broadened my understanding of din. It's not just a narrow religious category, it's this whole living system. How does the source kind of tie all these threads together? Does it present din as this comprehensive knowledge?
Yes, absolutely. Surah At-Tawbah, verses 119-122, presents din exactly like that. Comprehensive knowledge. It covers material life, spiritual life, legal matters, social structures, even politics. That call, "liyetefekkahu fi din," to gain deep understanding in din, it isn't just about theology books. It's a call for intellectual engagement across all these fields.
All of them.
Yes, to illuminate society, to build a system of values that genuinely protects humanity. So, for example, materially, din informs ethical business. Spiritually, it's about inner peace. Legally, it guides justice. Socially, it builds community. Politically, it demands accountability. The Quran doesn't see material and non-material life as separate or conflicting. They're two sides of one reality, and din illuminates both. It's an invitation to think deeply, to really understand.
So it's not just about belief, it's about how to live, how to organize society, how to build something just and good. That truly makes it a guide for everything.
Exactly. And grasping that comprehensive nature is key because it shows every part of our lives, personal ethics, societal structures, can and should be brought into harmony under this umbrella of din.
And circling back, as the source emphasizes from Surah Yunus 101, 109, all these roads within din, they all lead back to Tawhid, right? It's like the central power station for the whole city of din.
That's the perfect analogy. If you try to bypass Tawhid, the whole system loses its power, its light. It underscores just how absolutely essential it is.
Wow. What a journey into the heart of din that was. We've really seen how Professor Dosan's work pushes us, urges us, to maybe shed some of those layers of interpretation built up over centuries, and to get back to the Qur'an's direct, liberating message. Din, in its pure form, is Tawhid, complete, sincere submission to Allah alone, covering faith, ethics, social order, knowledge, everything. A path that's meant to be easy, progressive, truly freeing.
And it really hammers home that the Quran is the sole authority for understanding this din. Free from human distortions, those parallel texts, superstitious add-ons. It's a call for critical thinking, deep intellectual engagement with the divine message itself, rejecting attempts to overcomplicate what Allah made simple and clear.
This really reframes things, doesn't it? Our personal relationship with faith, our role in society, moving from just passive receivers to active participants in upholding something just and harmonious. It reminds us our din should actually simplify our lives, not make them more complex, make things easier, not harder.
And that's a crucial takeaway. Allah's din is explicitly free from haraj. That means difficulty, hardship. It's free from confusing dogma, pointless rituals, self-punishing practices. It's a din designed to fit perfectly with our human nature, to help us grow, to promote ease, not burden. It's a path for human flourishing.
So maybe we can leave you, the listener, with this thought. If din is meant to be this safe haven, like Noah's Ark, as the source suggests, are there interpretations you might be holding on to that are actually like extra baggage, weighing the ark down? Or maybe even drifting you towards a shore that isn't the one intended? What stands out to you from today's deep dive? How might you re-examine your own understanding of this incredibly profound concept? Thank you for diving deep with us today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
예.
宗教って私たちが普段何気なく使う言葉ですよね。
ええ、そうですね。
でもイスラム教の文脈で宗教と訳されることが、宗教って私たちが普段何気なく使う言葉ですよね。
ええ、そうですね。
でもイスラム教の文脈で宗教と訳されることが多いこのアラビア語のディン。
はい。
もしこの言葉が私たちが普通に思う宗教のイメージよりももっとずっと広くて、なんていうか人生の根本に関わるようなそういう深い意味を持っていたとしたら、あなたはどう感じますか？
それは多くの人にとってはかなり、意外な発見かもしれませんね。
ですよね。普段私たちが使ってる宗教という言葉のイメージとはだいぶ違う顔が見えてきそうです。
今回はまさにそのディーンっていう言葉のその奥深さに迫ってみたいんです。
よりどころにするのはムハメット・ヌル・ドアン教授の研究、クルアン・ニン・ディン・デディ。クルアンそのものがディーンをどう語っているのか、その核心を探っていきましょう。
はい。
あなたが今お持ちの宗教のイメージをちょっと一旦脇に置いて、一緒にこの探求の旅に出かけてみませんか？
お願いします。ドアン教授がこの研究で光を当てようとしているのは、非常に重要な問題意識なんですね。
問題意識ですか？
はい。教授によれば、クルアンの中心的な概念、もちろんこのディーンもそうですけれども、そういった大切な言葉が、歴史の流れの中で本来持っていた生き生きとした意味を失ってしまって。
なるほど。
それで形だけの慣習とか、あるいはすごく表面的な理解に なんかこうすり替わってしまっているんじゃないかと、そういう指摘なんです。
本来の意味がどこかで失われてしまったと。それは大きな問題ですね。
そうなんです。そしてその意味のズレとか形骸化っていうのが、実はクルアンが本当に伝えようとしている本質、つまり神様が意図したメッセージを私たちがちゃんと理解する上ですごく大きな壁になってしまっている。
なるほど。
これがドアン教授の研究の出発点であり、現代理の継承でもあるわけです。
なるほど。ではなぜ今そのディーンの本来の意味を探ることがそんなにも大切なんでしょうか。ドアン教授は現代のムスリム社会で見られるディーンの捉え方がクルアン本来の教えとは少しずれてきていると、そういうふうに指摘しているんですよね。
はい、おっしゃる通りです。教授の著者の序文を読むとですね、例えば本来の意味が薄れてしまったような信仰過剰とか儀礼だけがやたら強調されたり、あるいは特定の聖人みたいな人を崇拝するような傾向が出たり、あとは預言者の原稿録とされる伝承、ハリースですね。これにちょっと過度に依存してしまうとか。
具体例が挙げられているんですね。
他にも服装の規定にすごくこだわりすぎたり、特定の人物をもう盲目的に信じちゃったり、こういったことはクルアンが示すディーンの本質というよりは、どちらかというと人間が後から付け加えた、いわば外側の慣習に重きを置きすぎている状態じゃないかと。
そうした理解のズレが具体的にはどんな影響を及ぼしているというふうに考えられますか？
ドアン教授はこれが単なる解釈の違いにとどまらない、もっと深刻な問題につながっている可能性があると指摘しています。
深刻な問題ですか？
例えば社会全体の活力が失われたり、あるいはムスリム間での対立が深まってしまったり、時には過激な思想を生む土壌になったりすることもあると。さらにはイスラムそのものに対する誤解や偏見、いわゆるイスラモフォビアですね。これを助長する一因にもなりかねまいというふうに分析しているんです。
それはかなり根深い問題ですね。だからこそ原点であるクルアーンに立ち返って、ディーンが本来何を意味しているのかをもう一度しっかり確認する必要があると。
まさにクルアン自身に語らせる、それが重要だということです。では、そのクルアーンにおけるディーンの最も根本的で核心となる意味は何なのか。それは唯一の神アッランへの完全な服従、つまりイスラームそのものなんです。そして神はただ一人であるという真理、タウヒードを受け入れること。これが根幹です。
イスラームという言葉自体がまさに服従とか平和への帰依を意味しますもんね。これっていわゆるイスラム教徒と呼ばれる人たちだけの話ではないということですか？
そうなんです。そこが重要で、ドアン教授の研究が強調するのは、この神への完全な服従というディーンは、例えばアブラハムやモーセ、イエスといったクルアンが挙げる全ての預言者たちに共通する普遍的なメッセージなんだということです。だから特定の民族とか特定の時代に限定されるものじゃなくて、人間存在のもっと根本的なあり方として描かれているんですね。
それはかなり視野が広がりますね。そして有名なファーティハ章、解誕の章に出てくるディーンの日の解釈もドアン教授の視点だとまた違った光景が見えてくると思います。どうですか？一般的には審判の日、つまり最後の審判の日って訳されることが多いですけど。
そこが非常に面白い点なんです。ドアン教授はファーティハ章の文脈を丁寧に読み解くと、このディーンの日、ヤウムディーンは単に遠い未来の審判の日だけを指しているんじゃなくて、むしろ今この現世で神の導きに従って生きる時間、生活そのものをも含んでいる可能性があるんじゃないかと指摘してるんです。
つまりディーンは未来の裁きをただ待つだけじゃなくて、今この瞬間の生き方そのものに関わってくるということですか？
そういうことになりますね。神のルールとか導きが適用される領域とか時間がまさに今ここにあるんだという捉え方です。
なるほど。
これはディーンが非常にアクティブで現在の私たちの生活に直結する概念であることを示唆していますよね。
服従と唯一心信仰が核にあるとして、それ以外にもディーンには重要な意味合いがあるんですよね。
はい、もちろんです。クロアンを飲んでいくと、ディーンは神からの導きそのもの、あるいは私たちが進むべき正しい道を指したり。
道ですか？
そしてもっと広く、人生のあらゆる側面をカバーするような包括的なシステムとか生き方そのものを指していることがわかるんです。
システムや生き方ですか？それはかなり広範な意味ですね。
例えば、人間が自分自身の気まぐれな欲望、クルワンではハワーと呼ばれますけど、
ハワ
それに従ってしまうこととか、この世の表面的な楽しみに気を取られて、もっと大切なことを見失ってしまうこと。クルワンはそういう生き方をディーンを遊びや気晴らしにすることだと警告しています。
ー。なるほど。
これは神が示してくれた生き方のシステムを、軽んじる態度への戒めと言えるでしょうね。
神様が定めたルールとか生き方の枠組みのようなものがあると。
そうです。例えば、キリスト教徒に対してイエスに関する信仰においてディーンの限界を超えるなとクルワンが語りかける箇所があります。
はい。
これも神が定めた教えの枠組み、つまりディーンをちゃんと尊重しなさいということの重要性を示しています。また、アブラハルのミッタ、つまり彼の生き方ですね。純粋な唯一神信仰に基づく道。これが正しいディーンとして示される箇所もあります。
アブラハムの道が。
そこでは具体的な倫理、例えば親孝行しなさいとか、人を殺してはいけないとか、公正に取引しなさいとか、そういうことも含めて、生活全般にわたる包括的な指針としてのディーンが浮かび上がってきます。
なるほど。服従であり、導きであり、システムでもある。かなり多層的ですね。さらに、法や裁きといった意味も含まれるんですよね。
その通りです。これは、ディーンが持つ、より具体的な社会的側面、あるいは応法的な側面と言えるかもしれません。
社会的、応法的。
法としては、神が定めた法、シャリアの一部を指すこともありますし、面白いことに時には人間社会の法制度を指して使われることもあるんです。
神の法だけではないんですね。
例えば、クルアンのニュール章では、不法な性行為に対する罰則について、アッラーのディーン、法において、彼らに同情してはならないと述べられています。これは神の法ですね。
はい。
一方でユースフ書、ヨセフの物語の中では、ヨセフが兄弟の一人をエジプトに留め置くための策略として、王のディーン、法を利用する場面が描かれています。
ありましたね。
ここでは明らかにエジプト王朝の法律とか慣習を指してディーンという言葉が使われているわけです。
文脈によって意味合いが変わるんですね。裁きや褒章という意味合いはどうでしょうか？
こちらも重要です。例えば先ほどのニュール章の別の箇所では、審判の日になると、神は人々に彼らの真のディーン、報酬を完全に支払うとあります。
真の報酬。
ここでのディーンは、その人の行いに応じた公正な結果、つまり報奨や懲罰を意味しています。
ということは、ファーティア章のディーンの日も、やっぱり現世での生き方という意味と、来世での裁き報いという両方の意味合いを重ね持つ、非常に深い言葉だと言えそうですね。
まさにそう考えられますね。現世でどのディーン、つまりどのシステム、法、生き方に従うかが、来世でのディーン、つまり報いにつながっていくというような、そういう連続性が見て取れるかもしれません。
なるほど。ここまで様々なディーンの意味合いを見てきましたが、クルアンが繰り返し強調するある重要な姿勢があるそうですね。ムフリシーナ・ラフディン。これはどういう意味なんでしょう？
これはですね、ディーンを理解する上で、おそらく最も重要なキーワードの一つと言っていいと思います。
最も重要。
ディーンを誠実に純粋に神のためだけのものとするという、そういう意味合いです。
神のためだけのものとする。
つまり、私たちの信仰とか崇拝、信頼、そして宗教的な実践や理解のすべてを他の何者でもなく、唯一の神、アッラー、そしてその啓示であるクルアンだけに捧げなさいということです。
人間が作り出した例えば仲介者とか後付けの慣習とかそういうものを一切排除して神と直接向き合うということでしょうか？
まさに。ドアン教授も指摘していますが、クルアンはこの誠実さ、純粋さを説明するために非常に印象的な比喩を使っているんです。
比喩ですか？
それは海で嵐にあった船乗りたちの例えです。
嵐の中の船乗りですか？
はい。人々は平穏な時にはいろんな神々に祈ったり、人間的な力に頼ったりしているわけです。でも、いざ嵐にあって、船が沈みそうになって、もう死ぬかもしれないっていう恐怖に直面すると、他のあらゆる頼りの綱のことなんてもうすっかり忘れて、ただ一心に純粋にアッラだけに助けを求めるんです。
どうか助けてくださいと。
極限状態になると本質が見えると。しかし、皮肉なことに、神が彼らを救って無事に陸に上がると、 また元のあれこれ頼る多神教的な習慣に戻ってしまうとクランは語るんですね。
なるほど。
この比喩が教えてくれるのは、困難な時だけじゃなく、常に私たちのディーンを純粋に神のためだけのものに保つことの重要性、混ぜ物をしてはいけないということですね。
なるほど。そして、クルアンのバイイナ章では、このディーンを誠実に神のためだけのものとする姿勢こそが、カッテイマナディーン、つまり確立された正しいディーンなのだと、はっきり定義している点も重要なんですね。
その通りです。つまり、ディーンの本質っていうのは、外面的な形式とか複雑な儀礼にあるんじゃなくて、神に対してどれだけ純粋で誠実であるかという、その内面的な姿勢にあるんだということが強調されているわけです。
しかし、現実は、そのディーンが本来の意味から離れて、歪められたり、あるいは分裂させられたりする危険性があると、ドアン教授はクルアーンから読み解いているわけですね。
はい。クルアーン自身がその危険性についてはっきりと警告しています。例えば、ある箇所では、ユダヤ教徒の一部が言葉をその本来あるべき場所からねじ曲げて、ディーンを歪め教しようとしていると指摘されています。
歪め教ですか？
ええ。また、先ほども少し触れましたが、キリスト教徒に対しては、イエスへの信仰において、ディーンの限界を超えるなと釘を刺しています。
宗派分裂についても厳しい言葉があるんですね。
ええ、ありますね。自分たちのディーンをバラバラに分裂させ、それぞれが党派、宗派ですね。それに分かれてしまった人々について、クルアーンは繰り返し警告しています。
はい。
そして、各党派は自分たちが持っているもの、つまり自分たちの解釈や主張に満足し、逸に入っていると、その自己満足的な姿勢を批判しているんです。
ここで最初にドアン教授が指摘していた、人間が作り上げたディーンと神が掲示したディーンの対比が改めて鮮明になりますね。
まさにドアン教授はこういう分裂とか歪みが起こるのは人々がクルアーンという神が与えた確かな綱あるいは絆ですね、そこから手を離してしまうからだと分析しています。
クルアーンから離れてしまうから。
クルアーンから離れて人間的な解釈とか特定の指導者への追従あるいは宗派間の対立なんかに固執することでディーンは本来持っていたはずの普遍性とか統一性を失って細分化され時には対立を生むものになってしまうというわけです。
ではそのディーンと具体的な実践、例えばイスラム教徒が行うサラーと礼拝ですねやザカとキシャとの関係はどう考えればいいんでしょうか。クルアンはこれらについても触れていますよね。
はい。もちろん、多くの箇所でディーンとサラーとザカーとは密接に関連づけられています。信仰を持つ者の重要な特徴として、サラートを確立し、あるいは実践し、ザカートを施すことが挙げられていますね。これらは神への信仰を具体的な形で表現し、社会的な責任を果たす行為として、位置づけられているわけです。
ドワン教授は、このサラートの意味についても、私たちが一般的にイメージする五体統治の礼拝だけではないもっと広い意味合いがある可能性を指摘しているんですよね。
そこがまたドアン教授の解釈の、興味深いところなんです。もちろん儀礼的な礼拝もサラートの重要な一部ではあるんですが、文脈によってはもっと広くディーン、つまり神のシステムや呼びかけを確立し維持し支援するための行為全体を指している可能性があると示唆しているんです。
ディーンを支える行為ですか？具体的にはどういうことでしょ
う？例えばですね、クルアンのある箇所では、多神教徒からイスラムに改宗した人々が真の信者の同胞とみなされる条件として、悔い改めてサラートを確立し、ザカートを施すならばと述べられています。
はい。
これは単に儀礼的な礼拝を始めたということだけではなくて、ムスリム共同体の一員として神が示すシステム、つまりディーンを積極的に支え貢献する活動に参加し始めた、そういう意味合いを含んでいるかもしれないという解釈なんです。
なるほど。行動とか貢献という意味合いも出てくるんですね。アンファール省での多神教徒のサラートの解釈もかなりユニークですよね。
これは非常に示唆に富む解釈だと思います。アンファール省でメッカのカーバ神殿における多神教徒たちのサラートが 口笛と拍手以外の何者でもなかったと、批判的に述べられている箇所があるんです。
へえ、ありましたね。
従来は彼らの礼拝がなんか騒がしくて真剣さに欠けていたというような意味で解釈されることが多かったんですが、ドアン教授はちょっと違う可能性を提示します。
どんな可能性でしょ
ここでのサラートは、彼らが儀礼的な礼拝をしていたというよりは、預言者ムハンマドのサラート。つまり彼の呼びかけや教えに対して、彼らが口笛を吹いたり、手を叩いたりして、妨害し、やじを飛ばし、抗議していた、その行為そのものを指しているんじゃないかと。
う。ああ、なるほど。呼びかけに対する妨害行為がサラートだと。
もしそうだとすると、サラートという言葉が文脈によっては呼びかけやあるいはその呼びかけに対する応答や行動、この場合は妨害行動ですけど、それをも意味し得るということになりますよね。
はい。
これはサラートを単なる儀式としてだけじゃなく、もっとダイナミックな社会的な相互作用の一部として捉える視点を開くものだと思うんです。
それは面白いですね。ディーンが包括的なシステムであるなら、それを支えるサラートも単なる儀礼にとどまらない広い意味を持つというのは、なんだか理にかなっているように感じます。
ええ、クルアンの言葉の多層性というか深さを感じさせる部分ですね。
さて、最後に、クルアンがディーンについて強調しているもう一つの重要な点に触れておきたいと思います。
はい。
それは、ディーンにおける困難さの不在、つまり容易さです。8章には、神がディーンにおいてあなた方に困難、ハラジを課さなかった、とはっきり述べられていますね。
はい、これは非常に大切なメッセージだと思います。ちょっと思い出してほしいんですが、ドアン教授が序文で批判していたのは、人間が後から付け加えた複雑で時には実行が難しいような儀式とか、数多くの禁止事項、タブーですね。あるいは苦行のような要素でしたよね。
ええ、ありました。
クルアン自身が語るディーンは、それとは全く対照的に、基本的に容易であって、人間に過度な負担を強いるものではないんだ、ということが強調されているんです。
人間の本来の性質に合っているということでしょうか。
その通りです。フィトラという言葉がありますが、人間の自然な本来のあり方に適合しているということです。
フィトラ。
ええ。著名なクルアン注釈家であるムハンマド・アサドも、この困難のなさについて、イスラームの教えが神秘主義的な難解さとか、過度に形式ばったルール、あるいは必要な自己否定みたいなものから自由であることを示していると指摘しています。
なるほど。
ディーンは人々が自然に受け入れて無理なく実践できる範囲内にあるべきものなんだという考え方がその根底にあるんですね。
なるほど。人間が作り出した宗教はどうしても複雑で難しくなりがちだけど、神が示した本来のディーンはもっとシンプルで実践しやすいものだということですね。
そういう対比が見えてくると思います。ええ。
さて、ここまでムハンメト・ヌル・ドアン教授の研究を手がかりに、クルアンをおけるディーンの多層的な意味を探ってきました。見えてきたのは、私たちが普段使う宗教という言葉の枠には、到底収まらない、もっと広大で人生の根幹に関わる概念でしたね。
ええ、本当にそうですね。まとめると、唯一の神への完全な服従、つまりタウヒードを核として、それは神からの導き、私たちが歩むべき道であり、生活全体を覆う包括的なシステムであり、
はい。
さらには社会的な法や行いに対する裁き、法務用も意味していました。
そして何よりそのディーンは常に神の啓示であるクルアンに根ざしていて、人間が後から付け加えた複雑さや困難さではなく、誠実さ、つまり無不利推であることと本来的な容易さによって特徴づけられるべきものだということでした。
まさにその通りですね。では最後に、ここまで一緒に探求してくださったあなたにですね、一つ問いかけをさせてください。
はい。
このクルアンが本来示しているディーンの広がりと深さ、そしてその純粋さや容易さ、こういった点に触れてみて、あなた自身の信仰や日々の実践、あるいは知識や理解を深めていくプロセスに対して、何か新しい視点とか、あるいは変化の可能性、そういったものを感じることはあったでしょうか？
深い問いかけですね。単なる知識として終わるんじゃなくて、自分自身の在り方にも関わってくるような。
この探求があなたにとってさらにご自身の理解を深め、もしかしたら何か新しい一歩を踏み出すための小さなきっかけとなることができれば、これほど嬉しいことはありません。
你有没有想过定这个词，我们平时可能就简单的把它想成是宗教，但它在古兰经里头那个原始的含义可能比我们想的要复杂的多，也深刻的多。我们今天要聊的这份资料啊，它就提出了一个挺有意思的观点，就是我们普遍理解的定跟古兰经它自己文本里说的可能差别还挺大的。
没错，是这样。我们今天看的这份材料是穆罕默德·诺尔多安教授的一本书，叫《Quran Lin Din Dedi》，翻译过来就是古兰经所说的那个 din。这本书它主要干了啥呢？就是对古兰经里 din 这个特关键的词儿做了个语义上的深挖，想弄明白它本来到底是啥意思。
对，我感觉你分享这份资料可能也是想就是透过后来那些各种各样的解读啊、实践啊，去看看古兰经里头定它最核心的东西到底是什么。所以咱们这次的目标就是根据这份文本，揭开定它好几层意思，而且要特别看看古兰经里那个原始的概念，跟作者批评的那些就是后来的解读，或者说现在大家普遍的做法，到底有哪些不一样的地方。
对。咱们就一起来捋一捋这份文本的说法，看看它是怎么解释定的。它不光是一个信仰上的宣告。
All right, let's jump right in. We're going to be exploring a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty provocative book by Professor Muhammet Nur Doğan. His whole argument is that the idea of religion, as many people in Islam understand it today, has been seriously distorted over the years. So he wants to take us all the way back to the source to see what it really meant. And this leads us to the core question of his entire book, the one that really frames everything we're about to discuss. What if the complex system of rules, rituals, and traditions that so many people call religion today is just fundamentally different from the concept the Quran calls deen? That's a huge question, and it points to a real crisis of meaning. So the author's main idea is that over the centuries, some really key Quranic concepts have been twisted, stretched, and in some cases totally emptied of their original meaning. And this, he says, has created a massive disconnect between the original message and what a lot of people are practicing today. And this quote from the author's preface just nails the problem he's trying to solve. He sees this drift away from what he believes is the divine will. And it's not because there's a problem with the source text, he argues, but because of how it's been interpreted and distorted throughout history. So what is this distorted version he's talking about? Well, he gives it a name. He calls it the fabricated deen, or the fabricated religion. He describes it as a system that's been built up over time, based more on human culture, traditions, and historical baggage than on the divine text itself. And he doesn't just leave it at abstract ideas. He gets very specific. He points to things that you can see and touch, like sectarian divisions, Sunni, Shia, and so on. He talks about the veneration of objects and tombs, and the belief that saints or prophets can intervene on your behalf. He even includes the belief in certain fables, like the Miraj, the story of the prophet's night journey, and argues that treating books written by humans with a reverence that should be reserved for scripture, well, that's all part of this fabricated system. And here's why this is so critical for him. He makes a really bold claim. He says this fabricated religion isn't just some theological mistake. He argues it's the root cause of some very real-world problems. He connects it directly to conflicts happening within Muslim societies, and even says it's the stuff that fuels Islamophobia around the world. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? This is where the author shifts gears. He moves from diagnosing the issue to presenting what he argues is the actual Quranic definition of deen, based strictly on the language and context found within the text itself. So, the first and most fundamental meaning he pulls out is simply this: submission. The term is al-Islam. He argues it's not a cultural label or a list of things to do, but an internal state of being, the complete willing submission to the one God. And he points out that this was the same principle shared by all the prophets. Then there's a second layer. Deen also means God's guidance, or hudallah. So here, it's not just about that internal feeling of submission, it's also the external roadmap. It's the system of moral and ethical principles that God has revealed to help guide us. You could almost think of it as the divine instruction manual for how to live a good life. And third, right at the theological core of it all, is pure monotheism, or tawhid. This is the absolute non-negotiable principle that there is only one God, period. No partners, no intermediaries. The author really stresses that this was the single, unifying message of every single prophet throughout history. So now we have these two totally different pictures of what din is, right? On one hand, you've got this complex cultural system, and on the other, you have this idea of a direct relationship with God based on submission, guidance, and pure monotheism. Let's put them side by side and really see the difference. And when you look at it like this, wow, the contrast is just so stark. On one side, the author describes a din of human traditions that he says is complex, divisive, and often based on fear. But on the other side, he presents the Quranic din as being about God-given principles, simple and clear guidance, something that's unifying and ultimately liberating, freeing you from any authority except for God. The Quran actually has a specific term for this street path, Dinul Qayyim, which you can translate as the sound deen or the straight deen. The author explains this as a way of life that is in perfect harmony with what the Quran calls fitra, which is the natural, built-in disposition of every single human being. The idea is really cool. It suggests this religion isn't something foreign being imposed on you, but something that resonates with your deepest, most authentic self. So all of this leads to a pretty logical question. If there's such a massive gap between cultural practice and the original source, how on earth do you bridge it? Well, the author proposes a very clear path forward. His call to action is basically a three-step process. First, just acknowledge that the gap exists. Recognize that what's practiced culturally might be different from the text. Second, start questioning the intermediaries, all those layers of tradition and human interpretation that have built up over the centuries. And third, and this is the big one, return directly to the source. In the end, his entire complex argument really boils down to this one single, powerful piece of advice. He's not asking you to follow him or believe him. He's asking you to go past him, past all the other interpreters, and engage directly with the Quran to figure out what deen means for yourself. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. You know, regardless of your personal faith or background, the author's work brings up a really compelling question about how we read any important text. How different might any foundational document, religious or otherwise, look if we could somehow read it with fresh eyes, completely free from the incredible weight of centuries of interpretation? It's definitely a question worth thinking about.
All right, let's dive right into a really provocative idea, one that comes from the work of Professor Muhammet Nur Doğan. It's a simple question, but it has huge implications. What if the very meaning of religion... All right, let's dive right into a really provocative idea, one that comes from the work of Professor Muhammet Nur Doğan. It's a simple question, but it has huge implications. What if the very meaning of religion, as many Muslims understand it today, has been, well, kind of lost in translation over the centuries?
I mean, really think about that for a second. What if the most essential ideas in the Quran have drifted so far from what they originally meant? That's the core premise we're going to unpack today. We're going on a journey to figure out what the Quran actually means when it uses the word deen.
So where does this whole problem even begin? Well, the central argument is that over hundreds and hundreds of years, this massive gap has formed. On one side, you have the Quran's original message, and on the other, you have all these cultural traditions that many people now just assume are the religion.
And this quote from the author's preface, wow, it just cuts right to the heart of the issue. The big worry here is something called semantic drift. You know, it's when words slowly, almost sneakily, change their meaning over time. And the end result? It's become, as he argues, almost impossible to figure out what God's original message even was.
So, okay, if the meaning is drifted, what are we left with? The author has a very specific term for it. He calls it a fabricated din. Basically, a human-made religion, something built up over time, just layer upon layer of traditions and interpretations.
And he gets really specific about what this looks like in the real world. You know, he points to things he sees as symptoms, like an obsession with objects, rosaries, special clothes, or the belief that saints can step in and help you out, or getting bogged down in tiny ritual details. This also includes, and this is a big one for him, accepting hadith collections as a second, almost equal primary source of religion, something he argues was never the intention.
And look, this isn't just some abstract, theological debate for him. No way. The author draws a straight line from this fabricated din to a lot of the social and political problems we see in Muslim societies. The argument is simple. Losing the original meaning isn't just a spiritual problem. It has had massive real-world consequences.
Okay, so if that's the fabricated religion, then what's the real deal? What's the authentic one? Well, to figure that out, you gotta go back to the source, right? Back to the Quran itself. So when you look at the Quran, the concept of deen is actually pretty straightforward. It's built on a few core ideas. First, it's about total submission and devotion to God. Second, it's about pure, unshakable monotheism, what's known as Tawheed. This is the idea that God is the one and only authority. And third, it's about following that system of moral guidance that God revealed through the prophets.
And this is where you can really see the contrast, side by side. On one hand, you've got the fabricated deen, which the author says is all about human traditions, fear, division. It complicates everything. But on the other hand, you have the Quranic deen. And that's presented as God-given, liberating, empowering, and unifying for everyone. It's a system that's supposed to be based on the Quran, on reason, and on nature itself, not just on cultural traditions and hearsay.
And it turns out, there's actually a specific term in the Quran for this original, uncorrupted version of religion. That term is Deen-ul-Qayyim. You can translate it as the straight or sound deen. This is supposed to be the authentic religion. It's pure monotheism, and this is key, it's in perfect harmony with the natural order of the universe and with our own built-in human nature, a concept called fitra.
And this, right here, brings us back to the core problem he's identifying. The real tragedy from this perspective is that this simple, straightforward path, this Deen-ul-Qayyum, has been buried. It's been covered by so many layers of cultural additions and human interpretations over the centuries that it's become nearly impossible to even see it anymore.
So, if the gap is that huge, what do you do about it? What's the author's solution for actually bridging that divide?
Well, he lays out a pretty clear three-step call to action. First things first, just acknowledge that the gap is real. Recognize the difference between cultural habits and the Quranic message. Step 2, prioritize the source. That means returning to the Quran as the one and only unadulterated source for understanding what deen is. And finally, step 3, really engage with the text. Read it for yourself with the goal of understanding its world, trying your best to leave all that later cultural baggage at the door.
Now, just to be super clear, he's not saying, let's go start a new sect. Not at all. This is a call for a new method. It's an invitation, really, for each person to take a personal, intellectual journey back to the original source and just read it for themselves.
And that really leaves us with a huge question to chew on, doesn't it? How might any important text change if we could somehow read it without the weight of centuries of interpretation? You know, if we could just approach it fresh. It's a challenge that gets right to the heart of what faith, tradition, and our own personal understanding are all about.